Hey, good morning, everyone. Happy Friday morning to you, and welcome back to Morning Musings. My name is Don K. Preston. I am the president of Preterist Research Institute of Ardmore, Oklahoma, and we are continuing our review and refutation of Lance Conley's book, Hope Resurrected. And we're now in chapter 8. As I mentioned to you, we have given more than enough attention to his claims about the time statements meaning nothing. Now, don't forget, Mr. Conley told us on the one hand that time statements of imminence, when used in regard to non-eschatological events, indicated imminence. But when those same identical words in the same identical Greek tenses are used of eschatological events, they don't mean anything. All they mean now is certainty. It's so presuppositional. Well, after a couple of days of review, all of a sudden, Mr. Conley flip-flopped and actually admitted that the Greek word mello, for instance, can indicate imminence in prophetic text. He'll probably come unglued on that, but I have it all copied and pasted, all documented. And so on the one hand, he tells us that mello only indicates imminence if it's not eschatology, turns right around and says, well, actually mello can indicate imminence in eschatological text. Well, I'm sorry, that's a totally self-defeating argument. So, as I pointed out at the very beginning of our examination of his arguments on the time statements, if even one New Testament time statement of imminence referring to the second coming indicated genuine objective imminence, then this entire book goes down the drain. How has Mr. Conley responded to that? He has said, well, if those New Testament time statements are taken in a genuine sense, then we are following a failed eschatology. No, Mr. Conley. It is you and all futurists who want to deny, mitigate, pervert, destroy an entire vocabulary of words of imminence and say they didn't really mean anything except certain. It was impossible for those time words of imminence to mean imminence, just certain. Well, you can't prove that. It's a horrible argument, but all of that aside, here is Mr. Conley that is arguing that time statements really honestly do not mean anything in regard to imminence, in regard to the day of the Lord, the coming, the judgment, the resurrection. And yet I have demonstrated to you from Matthew 10, 22 and 23, from Matthew 16, 27, 28, oh, by the way, on which Mr. Conley once again did a flip-flop. In his book, he said that Matthew 16, 27 is the second coming. On Facebook, when that backfired on him, he said, no, Matthew 16, 27 is not the second coming. Well, then he equivocated again and said, well, it's about the transfiguration. Well, guess what, folks? The transfiguration was a vision of the second coming. Therefore, since the transfiguration was a visionary confirmation of Jesus' prediction of his coming in judgment in that generation, then since the transfiguration was a vision of his second coming, that means that Mr. Conley has once again fatally impaled himself on his own arguments. But we must go on. In chapter 8, and I have to tell you, I was a little bit amazed at the brevity of this particular chapter. Now, I do want to say this. First of all, this chapter, chapter 8, is only 2 pages and 6 lines long. And this particular chapter does not contain, I want to give credit, does not contain the multitudinous grammatical typological errors of the previous chapters. So, got to give credit where credit is due. I don't know the reason for that, but it is a fact. But here's the intriguing, here's the ironic thing about this. On Facebook, over and over and over and over again, Mr. Conley has attacked me on the issue of election. And he said election is the death knell to Preston and full preterism. They can't answer the doctrine of election. Well, I have answered it on Facebook and other forums, but of course he just ignores what I have to say, continuing to claim that I don't even address the issue. Now, what strikes me so strange is this. Here is a doctrine, i.e. the election, that Mr. Conley claims is foundational to his attack against covenant eschatology. It is the crux interpretum. It's the key. And yet he spends 2 pages and 7 lines on that doctrine. Now, that's after writing probably, I haven't counted them, but there's probably, about 19 pages, 18 pages on time statements. So, 2 pages, 7 lines, election, 18 or 19 pages on time statements. Utterly failing in his attack on the time statements. And let me say this to prepare for our next video on the election next week. Mr. Conley's claims on the election are some of the most presuppositional. Now, I'm not trying to be ugly, but I'm just telling you, when you read his comments, there are so many presuppositions underlying his claims that he makes no attempt whatsoever to prove. Now, look, I can make claims all day long. If I don't have the exegetical, the hermeneutical, the logical evidence to support my claim, I haven't proven one thing. And so, I'll just lay a little bit of groundwork today, and then we will proceed in next week's video to get down to some of the meat. In paragraph number 2, on page 90, Mr. Conley says, "Eklektos," which is translated as election, "is always definitive and temporal in both testaments of the Bible. Once election ends, it ends. There is no more selection to be had since the process is complete. For example, if election took place in 70 AD, there is no more to have happened post AD 70 because the election would be completed. In order for there to be a new election, one would have to be specified in Scripture, and there is none. As a matter of fact, Romans 11, 25 to 27 shows us that once God completes his number of Gentiles, and it is filled that all of the Gentiles who are of the elect will be saved, then all Israel shall be saved. All Jew and Gentile believers of the elect who chose Christ were chosen in 70 AD, if preterism is true, and it would be over." There are so many errors in this paragraph. Number one, it automatically says, if Christ came in AD 70, then the election is over. Well, you see, that's based upon the presupposition that after the coming of the Lord, which Mr. Conley believes occurs at the end of time, the passing of heaven and earth, okay? That's his presuppositional view of eschatology. It's what he's bringing into, reading into this paragraph. At the coming of the Lord, all evangelism ends. At the coming of the Lord, there is no more election, there's no more salvation being offered. Because that's the end. That's the end of the age. That's the end of the gospel preaching. And he gives us Romans 11, 25 to 27. as somehow, with no exegesis, by the way, that Romans 11:25-27 somehow proves that. Now, mind you, please notice, all he did was make claims. There is not one line of actual exegesis. Not one. There is not one exegetical analysis. There's just the claim, well, see, Romans 11, all Gentiles will be saved. The full number of the Gentiles will be saved at the coming of the Lord, and that's when Israel is saved, therefore nobody's saved after that. Well, let me say again, I could make any kind of claim without offering evidence. You know, I could make the claim that I was at Lake Eufaula and I saw a version of Nessie. But if I didn't have any evidence for it, people would be really right to be skeptical about that. There's got to be some evidence. And Mr. Conley gives no evidence whatsoever. I'm going to leave you with this thought. Mr. Conley says salvation, evangelism, time ends at the coming of the Lord. No. The current Christian age, the age of Christ and the New Covenant, the age which the Old Testament writers call the age to come, and which Mr. Conley himself admits had already broken into the Old Covenant world, the Old Covenant, this age. So, the New Testament writers, the Old Testament writers tell us that the age to come would never end. The Old Covenant age would. Okay? So the Old Covenant age, if it's true that election would end at the end of an age, and if it's true that the only age that was supposed to end was the Mosaic age, then guess what? That means election was to end at the end of the Old Covenant age. And Mr. Conley has just impaled himself again. All right? Hey, don't forget, be sure to get a copy of my 3-book offer that I'm offering for the month of February. We Shall Meet Him in the Air, The Wedding of the King of Kings, The Last Days Identified, and In Flaming Fire. I go over an awful lot of this stuff, especially the duration of the age to come from the perspective of the New Testament writers. Go to my website. Okay, these 3 books would cost you almost $60, regular price, plus shipping. But special for the month of February 2020, continental U.S. orders only, total delivered price, $40. If you want PDFs at a greatly reduced price, contact me, okay? Hey, look, thank you so much for joining me for this morning's Morning Musings. You have a fantastic weekend. Be safe. I'll see you on Monday.